Hello, this is our second lecture in conservation biology. This one is looking at conservation values of biodiversity. In this lecture, we're going into a bit more detail about how humans should value biodiversity, and also looking at how humans can put a value on biodiversity, and in particular, how humans can fit biodiversity into their economic systems. So in this lecture, we're going to go through, first of all, why biodiversity is valuable for humans. And we'll take a look at some terms, use or direct use values of biodiversity for humans, indirect or service values. And then we'll take a look at cost-benefit analysis. In other words, evaluating development projects to see whether the value gained from that economic development project matches the values lost if you destroy biodiversity. We'll also look at intrinsic values of biodiversity, or values of biodiversity which aren't dependent on human use or human valuation. And finally, we'll just take a brief look at the pros and cons of a dollar value. In other words, putting an economic value on biodiversity. Is it a good thing or is it not a good thing? Okay, first of all, why is biodiversity valuable for humans? Well, as I said in the last lecture, human society is essentially underpinned by biodiversity, and that includes human capitalist society. Western capitalist economic systems are underpinned by biodiversity. So things like production of water, animals pollinating crops and so on are quite often an integral part of human activities, for instance, pollination in agricultural activities, and yet they are not taken into account. Essentially, they're not paid for in this particular economic activity. This is known as an externality. So a lot of activities in the economic systems under the capitalist economic system are externalities. So there is a lot of use of natural environments without actually paying for it. And this is known as this property, because it's an inherent part of a capitalist system, it tends to persist. Now, this isn't a problem when that economic value increases for human society and biodiversity is not lost and external costs do not weigh on the rest of human society. So, for instance, if a activity is continued, economic activity such as a timber production from a forest, if that timber production is carried out in such a way that the overall forest is not degraded, and if you go back there in 100 years' time, the same forest exists there with all the biodiversity and all the other functions that that forest may serve for human society is still being carried out, then that development is sound and everything is great. However, if that timber production system degrades that forest and eliminates some of the other functions which that forest provides, for instance, the logging operation causes erosion and silting of streams and pollution of water supplies, or if the logging operation causes loss of bird species which tourists would previously come to look at, that leads to an overall decrease in the value of that forest to society. So that timber operation, through causing those externalities, is known as a failure. It is a market failure because it basically decreases the overall economic success of that particular society. And we want to try and avoid that. Unfortunately, it is difficult to make a case to avoid that when the biodiversity which is lost is not actually owned by anybody. So if it's not owned by anybody, and certainly nobody sees an immediate loss of economic value when the logging takes place, it's quite difficult to make a case that that economic system is, or that economic development is actually causing a problem to society. And that biodiversity, which is not owned by anybody, can be lost. In a particular case where harvesting of natural resources, which is not owned by anybody, for instance, going out fishing for fish in the sea, or in the case of Trinidad, going out into the forest and hunting for wild hog or quenk, and just taking it out of the bush without regard for its persistence into the future, that can lead to over-harvesting. And as we've seen before, over-harvesting can cause an extinction of that resource. And so is the case in Trinidad with the wild hog. Overhunting of the wild hog has led to it being almost extinct in Trinidad now. So surveys with camera trapping has shown reasonable populations of most game animals, but wild hog is almost completely absent from many of these forests. And this over-harvest of an unowned resource, natural resource, is known as tragedy of the commons. And this, unfortunately, is a very common feature of use of biodiversity, particularly production use of biodiversity. One way of trying to combat this overuse of biodiversity is by assigning appropriate costs to economic activities. In other words, making sure that the people who harvest that particular piece of biodiversity actually pay an economic cost if they overharvest it, if they damage the resource. One way of doing that is by taking that particular product or piece of biodiversity out of the commons and actually licensing a small group of people to be able to use that. So, for instance, in Trinidad, if we sold licenses to harvest quenk to only 10 people in the country, and only they were allowed to harvest quenk, they would have a vested interest in making sure that quenk continues into the future, because if it didn't, then you would lose that value of being able to harvest quenk. So those people would make sure that over-harvest of the quenk did not happen. So they would invest in anti-poaching activities. They would make sure that nobody else harvests quenk, and they would safeguard it. And this is one way of assigning an economic value to that quenk. Okay? Now, there are many different ways of calculating the economic costs that the people should pay. For instance, with our quenk example, what sort of money should they pay to have the license to harvest quenk? And there are different ways in which we can do that. And we're going to go through some of those different ways. In the case of the quenk, it's probably a direct cost for a product which is very tangible and can be sold in a market. So you can sell quenk in the supermarket for a certain price, and that would be the amount of money that the harvester of the quenk would get. So the government should charge a certain amount, probably below that cost, but certainly maybe 25 to 50% of that market cost. So the government would get a return and the person would also be able to make money off that quench and make it worth their while to protect. So some of the different economic costs or ways of valuing biodiversity are by looking at the use value, or the which is basically looking at how that biodiversity is used by people. So this is an anthropocentric view on the value of biodiversity. So this instrumental or utilitarian value of biodiversity, or use value of biodiversity, looks at biodiversity in terms of how people use it and how much they are willing to pay for it. In other words, a dollar value can be calculated from how much they are willing to pay for it. And we can divide up use value into direct use values and indirect use values. Direct use values are things which are tangible, which can be touched, which can be sold at a market. Things like the foods, for instance, quench, fuel like coleswood or just firewood, materials for building, medicines, pesticides, and other things which you can harvest, touch, and sell at a market. There are other ways in which humans can value biodiversity or use biodiversity by indirect use or through services. So biodiversity, by making up a natural ecosystem, can perform particular services which have indirect use to human society. Examples of this are water and soil generation. So water production, a natural ecosystem is the most effective way of producing water in a stream coming from the catchment, which is clothed in that natural ecosystem, which is completely free from pollution, siltation, soil, and so on. So water production is one service which a natural ecosystem provides, and that's true even here in Trinidad. So it's no accident that the reservoirs in which we get our water, the catchments for those reservoirs or where the water accumulates, streams and so on, tend to be fully forested. They are fully forested because these natural ecosystems keep the water clean into the reservoir. So there is minimum amounts of treatment that water requires before it is useful for people to drink. There are many other services, for instance, oxygen generation. Trees produce a lot of oxygen through their photosynthesis. Carbon scrubbing of the atmosphere or carbon sequestration. This is taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lowering the risk of global warming into the future. Pollination is also another very important service, and one which is very much in the news these days because bees are dying out in great numbers in many parts of the developed world. So, for instance, in North America and Europe, bee populations are collapsing. Nobody really knew why bees were dying off, but the effect of it was that pollination of crops which humans grew began to fall, and therefore returns from agriculture, economic returns from agriculture began to fall. Eventually, it was found out the reason why bee populations were falling was because of the use of nicotinoid pesticides on these crops. So when the bees went to pollinate the flowers, they picked up an unhealthy dose or a lethal dose of these pesticides, which basically killed them. Unfortunately, they took them back to the hive and the whole hive would die. So with the collapse of bee populations, pollination of these crops was not done, not carried out, so they failed to set fruit and then that fruit it wasn't there for harvest. So agricultural economic production fell. So in this way, farmers realized the cost of bees for pollination services for their crops. And in a place like Trinidad, where there are many more species of bees, wild bees out there, people are looking to try and conserve those natural ecosystems which support those bees. Okay, so you get an idea of what services are. There is another indirect use of biodiversity, which you must take into account also, and those are options and existence use of biodiversity. So option use is the value of biodiversity for future use. So what that means is that biodiversity may not be used today, but it may be used in the future. It may be used, for instance, for harvesting to make a particular drug for the treatment of cancer, for instance. If one day it is found that a previously unknown compound exists in a rainforest shrub, you need that rainforest shrub and its habitat still in existence. Otherwise, you're not going to get that drug. So the value of that, or the value of making sure that a forest is there so that if that medicine is required in the future, can be classed as an option value for that biodiversity. Let's take a closer look at direct use of biodiversity now. We can divide up direct use of biodiversity into two types: consumptive use value and productive use value. Consumptive use value is the value of that biodiversity when used directly by the harvester. No money or no dollars are involved. So consumptive use value is when a human goes into a natural ecosystem, harvests the biodiversity, and then uses it directly. All of the things which I've mentioned before, biodiversity can be food, fuel, building materials, medicines, and generally this consumptive use value is applied to those materials harvested by subsistence communities or communities which are outside of some sort of economic system, or at least a dollar-based economic system. And that's actually a large part of the global human food supply. There are a lot of human societies outside of that dollar economic system. So consumptive use is actually a very important use of biodiversity around the world. We can estimate the dollar value of that consumptive use by estimating the cost to buy similar goods at a market. Okay, so if a pig is used for food in a consumptive use manner, in other words, somebody goes out into the forest, shoots a wild hog, brings it back home, cuts it up and eats it within the house. It's not actually sold to anybody. Okay? How much would it cost to go to the supermarket now and buy pork? So the cost that it would take to buy the equivalent amount of pork would be known as the substitute cost for that wild hog shot in the forest. So in that way, a dollar value can be assigned to consumptive use, however indirectly and maybe possibly inaccurately. So here are some objects which are collected as consumptive use. I think this is the Philippines. This is a picture from your textbook where a local community member has hunted a wild hog and is in the process of butchering it here to take back to the village and consume. And this is actually insects. These insects have been collected and they are going to be processed and used for human consumption. This is in East Africa, I believe. And this is a product which you all know. This is firewood. Here in Trinidad, we don't really use firewood anymore, or the processed derivative, coals. But up until the 1950s, or soon after World War II, coals was the primary means of domestic fuel. Still, in large parts of the developing world, Africa, up in Haiti in the Caribbean, wood harvested from natural ecosystems is still the primary source of fuel for domestic cooking and so on. So this is a very important consumptive use product from a natural ecosystem. This consumptive use is often kept under control, and it doesn't unsustainably harvest products and therefore put biodiversity into problems. So this consumptive use is often regulated by cultural and societal structures. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, these cultural and societal structures have often been developed when there has been a shortage of these particular products, and so systems are put in place to alleviate that shortage or to prevent perceived danger in the breakdown of harvesting of that product in a sustainable manner. These regulations, these cultural and societal structures, quite often break down when a cash economy is introduced into an area. So subsistence people can actually begin to over-harvest their biodiversity when they are offered cash for the products which they harvest. So this transition from a consumptive use of biodiversity to a productive use of biodiversity needs to be managed properly. So I've introduced another term there, productive use. Well, consumptive use, you know what that is. Productive use is taking a product from a natural ecosystem, biodiversity, and selling it in a market. If quite often these days the consumptive use is sustainable, it's done by a small number of people and they only take what they need. The problem comes when that society transitions to a cash economy and individuals within that community see that the more they harvest, the more cash they can get, and therefore the greater things they can buy and the better living standards they can get. So they take the logical step of over-harvesting a previously sustainably harvested forest product. So a cash economy, or using a biodiversity product in a cash economy, is known as a productive use. So the productive use is harvesting biodiversity for sale at a market. So you don't actually use the biodiversity product yourself, you actually sell it at the market for money. So all of the products harvested for consumptive use can also be harvested for productive use. And it's quite easy to put a dollar value on productive use because you just simply need to visit the market and see what people are charging for the sale of that piece of biodiversity in the market. Over-harvesting can occur through productive use of biodiversity very quickly and very easily. particularly as if I've said before, the resource is in the commons and nobody actually owns it, and regulation by the government is not strong enough. So productive use of value of biodiversity or use of biodiversity for sale can lead to over-harvesting very quickly. So it's very important to be able to control your productive use. So that's what I mean when I mentioned in the previous slide that you must take a look at the transition from a consumptive use of biodiversity to that productive use of biodiversity. You're much less likely to over-harvest when you are using it consumptively than if you are using it productively. Okay, so some examples of biodiversity which is used productively. This is timber on the Amazon, timber harvested for the wood and wood products to make furniture, to make paper, and so on. And this is a market in a developing country, and it looks like they're selling honey there and various fruits and fruits and honey there. It looks like some nuts there as well. So in this case, biodiversity, in this case fruits, nuts, and honey, is being harvested and is being sold at a market. Okay, so all of these types of biodiversity are direct use of biodiversity. I want to take a look at now at indirect use of biodiversity. This is also known as ecosystem services, and I think I've outlined this already. Human societies use natural ecosystems which are made up of biodiversity for services. Things like water production, pollination, tourism, recreation, flood regulation, disaster mitigation are all used by human societies to stabilize those human societies and also to support economic development. These services are often valued with the cost of the technology and labor which would need to be used to achieve the same service. So for instance, we can put a dollar value on, say, pollination. If we look at the pollination of a crop, okay, and we estimate the amount of money that you get from selling the fruit from that crop, and then we prevent pollination of that crop, and we see how little fruit you get, and you sell that fruit, and then you can compare the amount that you would get from a pollinated crop and the amount that you would get from an unpollinated crop. The difference between those two amounts are the value of pollination. And it works out to be in the tens of millions of dollars every year for many countries. Pollination is very important. In the terms of the alternative for pollination by bees would be pollination by people. So you could have a person walking around the field, which is looking to be pollinated, and with a paintbrush transferring pollen from one flower to the next. The amount of time and labor which would be needed to be paid to achieve the same thing which bees do could also be used as a value of pollination in that crop. Okay. Water production can be valued by the amount that it would cost to clean up polluted water, silted water, or water which is lost from a catchment area when the natural ecosystems are removed. Flood regulation can be valued as a service by looking at the costs that it takes to clean up after a flood in a particular catchment. Because when you leave a forest on a catchment area, water flow is regulated because the water movement through the natural ecosystem is much slower than through a degraded, unnatural ecosystem. So you get less floods. Okay? So if you have one flood, you can calculate the cost that it would take to clean up after it, and that's the amount of money that that natural ecosystem provides in a flood regulation service. Okay? Just the pictures of some of the services which biodiversity provides. This is naturally pollination. You've got the bee, you've got the pollen, pollination. This one is the services that predators provide in controlling pests of crops. So this bird is eating a butterfly, which would lay caterpillars, which would eat the leaves of some crop plants. So the bird is providing a service to the farmer by controlling pests. And this actually is quite important when you look at crops and the amount of pesticides which need to be used when these predators are not available. All right, some indirect value of biodiversity, the services, are quite often not taken into consideration, and the value is often externalized from any development. So, for instance, looking at that sandals development in Tobago, is the value of the ocean currents there, and in particular the ability of the mangroves to filter the pollution from the development being taken into account? No, it is not. So the pollution which that sandals development is going to introduce into that marine environment needs to be cleaned up by something. If it is not cleaned up, then the rest of the human society may pick up the cost in the collapse of the Buku Reef, which will not do very well if there is raw sewage being dumped on top of the reef from the sandals development. So the natural ecosystems, and in this case maybe the mangroves, cleaning up this pollution needs to be taken into account. Ultimately, the sandals development is probably not going to take it into consideration. Okay? It is not going to pay for cleaning up its water pollution. So this brings into perspective the cost-benefit analysis. In many developed countries around the world and an increasing number of developing countries, before any development goes ahead, some sort of an environmental cost-benefit analysis needs to be carried out on development projects. And in this basically means that the development will give a quote of the economic benefits that it will provide. So for instance, if we're looking at a highway to Point Fortin, what are the economic developments which that highway is going to provide? It will improve access to Point Fortin. It will allow the development of trade in Point Fortin. It would increase the land values in Point Fortin. All of these things are economic benefits from building that highway to Point Fortin. But that needs to be counterbalanced against some of the possible environment negatives or some of the services and products which the highway is going to destroy by being built. So for instance, the highway is being built is right through the middle of the Silver Springs area. And over the years, many different visiting scientists had contributed to the Trinidad and Tobago economy by visiting that area and studying the fish which survive in these severely but naturally oil polluted streams in the area. So Trinidad and Tobago has benefited from these scientists visiting and studying the animals which live in these streams. If the highway is built through that area, all these streams will be lost, and Trinidad and Tobago will no longer benefit from that use of the biodiversity. So, is that loss in economic benefit and also the loss of other benefits which the highway would destroy by being built across the countryside equal or greater than the economic benefit that you get from increasing the land values or increasing trade in Point Fortin and so on? So that is the cost-benefit analysis. For some economic developments, the economic development to the society will be greater than the ecosystem services lost, and ultimately that which will have to be paid for by society, and the development should go ahead. But in many cases, the services are not recognized, they are hidden, and people don't realize by carrying out the development, they are destroying some services which they would ultimately need into the future. An example of that would be building a hotel in the valley below Serra del Aripo and in the catchment area for the Hollis Reservoir. If you build a hotel there, then the water in the reservoir immediately becomes polluted by that economic activity and all those people going to the toilet in that watershed. So we would lose the production of water from that Hollis Dam. Now, water is vital for human society. If we don't have water, we don't have human society. So the economic cost of losing the Hollis watershed and the water that it produces is ultimately too high and is going to be completely overshadow the economic benefit of building a hotel in what is admittedly a very beautiful part of Trinidad and Tobago. So in that case, the government would refuse that development. And in this particular case, that is actually what has happened. No economic developments are actually allowed in these catchment areas, at least up until now. Okay, there has been some talk of building a hotel on top of Serra del Aripo, but thankfully the top of Serra del Aripo is in the Hollis River catchment area, so that is a very strong argument not to build that hotel there and destroy the biodiversity which exists in those natural ecosystems. So I think I've gone through all of this, except to say that the loss of those ecosystem services or goods that biodiversity and natural ecosystems provide is often not immediately apparent. So, for instance, when you build that highway across the landscape to Point Fortin, you may not immediately see that you're actually cutting off the ability of fish to go and spawn in the upper reaches of the Orapooch swamp, the South Orapooch swamp. Okay, so the highway cuts off that pathway, and you only realize that this is a problem when 2 or 3 years down the track, the fishermen find they suddenly have no fish to catch because all the fish have died out because they can no longer spawn in the South Orapooch swamp. Okay? So in that case, that service was cryptic. You couldn't see it easily. Okay? Nobody listened to the scientists. Nobody ever listens to the scientists. and the development went ahead, and the result was a collapse in the fishing industry. Does that sound so unlikely? Unfortunately, it is not unlikely. It has happened in the past. So often the valuation of biodiversity goods and services is not available and actually needs research, but people with a vested interest in the development going ahead because they have land in Point Fortin, which they want to go up in value, will not allow that research to go ahead, and unfortunately the service is lost, and unfortunately the society loses out. Okay, so here's an infographic from your textbook, which gives some of the use values and non-use values, the direct use values, the indirect use values of a tropical wetland ecosystem. And many of these use and indirect use values can be applied to tropical wetlands like the South Oropouche Swamp or the Nariva Swamp in Trinidad. So some of the direct use values: fish and meat, fuel wood, timber and other building materials, medicinal plants, edible wild fruits and plants, animal fodder. So all of these things you can get, okay, from tropical wetlands. So you can imagine Nariva Swamp would provide all of these things. The South Oropouche, to a lesser extent, provide many of these things as well. Indirect use values: flood controls. Wetlands can absorb a lot of water and let it out slowly. Soil fertility: wetlands may provide a means of which silt is trapped and built up. The soil is built up in fertility through that. Pollution control: drinking water can be provided. Recreation and tourism, bird watching, education, biological services. Pollinators may live in the swamp and venture out to go and pollinate people's crops and so on. We also have option values, which I mentioned before: future medicine, future biological insight, future food sources or water supplies, all things which this tropical wetland could provide in the future. And also we have something here called an existence value. This is a non-use value or an intrinsic value of biodiversity. Okay, this type of biodiversity use doesn't actually harm the biodiversity or doesn't actually use the biodiversity, but people are still willing to pay money for it. Okay, and it's still important in a societal context. And that leads us on to intrinsic values of biodiversity. These are the non-use values of biodiversity, or the value of biodiversity in and of itself. Okay, these are the types of values which the preservationists that we mentioned in the previous lecture looked at biodiversity for. So humans undeniably have an intrinsic value. So each human being has a value in of themselves. Do other living or non-living things have intrinsic values? Some people would say yes. Plants and animals certainly have a clear interest in doing certain things to live, and so it is easier to see their intrinsic value and their right to be able to pursue those activities. Okay? You can, if you understand human rights, you can conceive of an intrinsic value of biodiversity by transferring those human rights onto biodiversity. As you can imagine, this is quite a contentious issue, because if we do that, then why would we go out there and shoot wild hog in the forest? Why would we go and do this? If that wild hog has a right to live, then why would we do it? If we don't want to contravene the intrinsic values of biodiversity. And in some religions, this is actually enshrined in that religion. Okay, quite often that is why many religions, like the Hindu religion, ultimately forbid killing of animals. Okay, they have their own right to pursue their existence. So it can be a bit difficult, and sometimes people put a scale of rights on different parts of biodiversity. So some parts of biodiversity which have a value, they have a value, but they they have an intrinsic value and they need to be respected, but they are also allowed to be harvested and so on. So a lot of these cultural norms are shaped by people's perception of an intrinsic value of biodiversity. In today's capitalist society, we can apply a value by the amount of money people are willing to pay to know that that biodiversity still exists. So in other words, they're willing to pay money for other people not to harvest that biodiversity. Okay, this may sound crazy, but it actually is a multi-million, if not billion-dollar activity. Okay, and that the most visible face of this type of value people put on biodiversity is run by these environmental NGOs like Friends of the Earth or World Wildlife Fund or the Nature Conservancy. These organizations will buy up areas of property and just leave them and preserve the biodiversity on them. The only way they can do that is by donations from people in North America and Europe, which allows them to do it. And so we can calculate an existence value, the amount that people are willing to pay to know that that biodiversity still exists. We can also ask people how much they're willing to pay to protect that biodiversity for future generations. So how much are you willing to pay so a tiger is still available in the wild for your grandchildren to go and see? How much are you willing to pay for that? And an example closer to home, how much are you willing to pay so that your grandchildren can go out and see or hunt a wild hog in Trinidad forests into the future? Because believe me, that wild hog isn't going to survive unless somebody protects it, right? And that is known as a behest value, and it is also an intrinsic or non-use value of biodiversity. All right, so here is an example of a non-use value of biodiversity. See that whale there? Nobody is using it, but these people are all paying money to this tourism operator. These people are paying money to this tourism operator to go and see this whale. So nobody is using this whale, but money is being made out of it. So that is an existence value of biodiversity. The non-extractive or the service and the service use of biodiversity or indirect use of biodiversity, coupled with those existence and behest values of biodiversity, are increasing in value year on year as more and more people become aware of the services and more people are willing to contribute money to make sure that biodiversity exists. Okay? By contrast, the value of biodiversity, which comes from extractive industries, so like timber or medicines and stuff, doesn't really tend to increase in value. It just fluctuates around a particular level. So the value of ecosystem services and stuff is becoming more and more appreciated, whereas the traditional use of biodiversity is remaining steady. So This gives us reason for hope. More and more people are seeing that biodiversity is useful in outside of that more traditional sense of something being harvested. So we still have that problem where people and not enough research and not enough knowledge is available to be able to accurately do that cost benefit analysis of whether a development is going to destroy ecosystem services and biodiversity, which has a productive value. We still don't know whether that development is going to do that or not. And in the face of this ignorance and this lack of knowledge, what should we do? Just go ahead with the development anyway, because we don't really know, so we might as well just go ahead with it. Okay? Unfortunately, that has been the approach in Trinidad up until now. In more developed countries, at least before Trump got in, the idea has been that that loss of biodiversity should be valued at its most expensive. So we look at the plants and animals in the forest as if they were the cures for cancer in the future. So we need to try and preserve them. We look at these plants and animals and ecosystems as if they do produce water for everybody and they will produce water in the future. And if you do that, you will see that biodiversity has an incalculable cost. It's priceless, and therefore it should not be destroyed. Okay? So the norm under this approach is conservation of that biodiversity, unless the costs or the benefits from the economic development are simply too great to ignore. Okay? So therefore the onus shifts to the developer to prove the opportunity costs are too great. Okay? So hopefully we're shifting in that approach, maybe here in Trinidad too. I think politicians, though, have to be introduced to the concept of the cost-benefit analysis of any development in an environmental context. There are some people, however, who say that biodiversity should not be assigned a dollar value. They believe that economic valuation and putting a dollar value will show that many species have no value. They're not actually useful for anything, apart from being part of a naturally functioning ecosystem. And that lack of value will be used as development and decision makers, used by developers and decision makers to carry ahead with all sorts of destructive environmentally destructive development. So essentially saying that a rainforest has the majority of the species within the rainforest have no value, and we would not be losing anything if we lost them. Okay? Other people would say yes, that fitting biodiversity into a current economic system allows people to see the economic importance of preserving biodiversity and natural ecosystems for human society, and therefore the importance of conservation. It's this second area which seems to be winning out. Since this book was published in 2010, it's now 2018, there's a new body in the United Nations called the International Protocol for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. So this new body is in charge of trying to assess the amount of money which biodiversity and natural ecosystems provides for human societies. So it is gaining a lot of play around the world today. Okay, hopefully we'll see more of it in Trinidad, and hopefully you people who learn about these things will be able to be part of that discourse in society into the future. All right, so that's the end of that lecture. Read these chapters 4, 5, and 6, particularly chapters 4 and 5, less so 6, and you'll be full bottle on valuation of biodiversity. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and here we go.